Glad you're with us on First Principles Daily, episode 20. Today we reason from raw materials, not analogy. In 1941, the world's penicillin could treat only a handful of patients. 3 years later, it covered every Allied casualty on D-Day because the process was rebuilt around oxygen transfer and reactor volume instead of flask surface area. In the spring of 1941, a single patient in Oxford received the entire British stock of penicillin. When the drug appeared in his urine, it was collected, purified again, and given back to him because there was nothing else. 3 years later, on the beaches of Normandy, medical units carried enough penicillin to treat every wounded soldier who needed it. The molecule itself had not changed. What changed was the engineering that turned a few micrograms per square centimeter of mold surface into kilograms per cubic meter of tank volume every day. The shift required recognizing that the binding constraint was never the chemistry of the beta-lactam ring, but the rate at which oxygen could be delivered to the growing organism and the sheer volume that could be held sterile at one time. The original production method grew Penicillium notatum on the surface of a shallow liquid medium inside hundreds of individual flasks or bottles. Each vessel offered only a thin layer of air-liquid interface. Oxygen reached the mold slowly and yield stayed low, often measured in a few milligrams per liter. The approach copied standard microbiological laboratory practice. The goal had always been to obtain enough material for identification and small animal tests rather than for thousands of human doses. Because every additional flask required more incubator space, more manual handling, and more risk of contamination, scaling simply meant building more of the same small units. The finished material therefore carried the full cost of that repetitive, labor-intensive surface culture plus repeated extraction steps performed on tiny volumes. Early published accounts describe the drug as so scarce that one course of treatment could cost the equivalent of several months of a skilled worker's wages. No one inside the small research groups questioned the flask geometry itself. It was the inherited tool for growing molds. The assumption was that any increase in supply would come from finding a slightly better mold strain or a slightly richer broth, while keeping the same surface culture format. That assumption fixed both the physical limit and the cost structure until the problem was handed to groups whose daily work involved large volume fluid handling rather than petri dishes. The surface method also locked in downstream bottlenecks. Each small batch had to be filtered, extracted with solvent, and concentrated separately. This multiplied the number of transfer steps and the opportunities for loss or contamination. Because the flask could not be pressurized or vigorously agitated without breaking the surface film, the organism never reached high cell densities. The same sugar and nitrogen inputs therefore produced far less product per kilogram consumed. The convention persisted because microbiologists had spent decades perfecting exactly this format for studying metabolism. The idea that the same organism might behave differently once oxygen supply was decoupled from surface area was outside the frame of reference. The decisive shift began when the question was restated as, how much penicillin can we produce per unit volume of reactor per day if oxygen transfer, not surface area, sets the rate? Deep tank submerged fermentation replaced the flasks with sealed, stirred, aerated vessels of thousands of liters. In these tanks, air was forced through spargers at the bottom, while mechanical agitators kept the broth mixed. Oxygen, therefore, dissolved throughout the liquid rather than only at the top surface. A rough magic wand estimate starts with the major inputs. Corn steep liquor, a cheap byproduct of wet milling, supplied nitrogen and growth factors at commodity prices on the order of a few cents per kilogram. Lactose or glucose provided carbon at similarly low agricultural prices. Mineral salts added negligible cost. The penicillin molecule itself contains only carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, and sulfur, all drawn from those inexpensive feedstocks. Adding the energy for aeration, agitation, and downstream solvent extraction still leaves a raw material floor that is a small fraction of even the later bulk drug price. Under the old surface culture regime, the finished cost sat many times higher than that floor. This produced an idiot index that reflected the multiplication of small vessels, repeated manual transfers, and low volumetric productivity rather than any scarcity of atoms. To see the index clearly, consider that the raw atoms might cost a few cents per dose, while the finished material required the labor of hundreds of flasks, each handled separately. The ratio of finished price to raw material cost therefore grew large because every added flask multiplied the handling steps without increasing the volume per step. Switching to deep tanks immediately raised the volume that could be processed in one vessel by orders of magnitude and eliminated most of the flask handling labor. The second move replaced the original low-yielding strain with isolates from a moldy cantaloupe collected in Peoria. Those strains produced several times more penicillin per gram of sugar consumed once they were grown under submerged conditions. The third move introduced deliberate mutation and selection programs that further increased the biosynthetic rate without changing the medium chemistry. Each of these steps attacked a different term in the same equation: oxygen transfer rate, biomass density, and specific productivity. The engineering trade-off that had to be solved was maintaining sterility at large scale while delivering sufficient power to the agitators and compressors. Once that mechanical problem was controlled, the biology scaled with the hardware instead of against it. One obvious objection is that larger vessels simply multiply contamination risk. Yet the teams addressed this by adopting the same clean-in-place and steam sterilization practices already routine in brewing and dairy processing. Another objection is that the new strains might lose productivity under the higher shear of mechanical stirring. In practice, the selected mutants proved more robust precisely because the selection pressure included the submerged environment itself. The arithmetic of the idiot index therefore moved because the dominant cost term changed from number of flasks times labor per flask to capital cost of tank plus energy per cubic meter. That quantity falls as volume increases. By the middle of 1944, submerged fermentation plants were producing penicillin at a rate that made the drug available for every Allied casualty who reached a clearing station. Published wartime production figures show output rising from kilograms per month to tons per month within roughly 2 years. The idiot index of the process fell sharply because the dominant costs shifted from repetitive small-scale handling to the capital cost of tanks and compressors. Those costs could then be amortized over far larger volumes. The remaining gap to the absolute raw material floor is still set by the energy required for aeration and the losses in extraction and purification, both of which are governed by physical chemistry rather than by the number of flasks. Trade-offs accepted along the way included the need for highly trained operators to keep large, sterile systems running and the capital intensity of building the first deep tank facilities. Those constraints were real, yet they proved far less limiting than the original surface culture ceiling. Even after the wartime effort, downstream solvent extraction and crystallization still accounted for a sizable fraction of the remaining cost. The molecule had to be separated from a complex broth without degrading the sensitive beta-lactam ring. The new limit was therefore no longer how many flasks could be tended by hand, but how efficiently the dissolved oxygen could be converted into product, and how completely the product could be recovered. When the limiting step is oxygen delivery into liquid rather than the number of glass surfaces, the entire cost structure moves with the reactor design instead of with laboratory tradition. When a growth medium is treated as an engineered fluid whose composition can be taken from an adjacent industry, the atoms stop being the scarce resource and the mixing equipment becomes the variable that can still be improved. The same reframing that turned penicillin from a urine recycling rarity into a standard issue medicine now sits in front of any process whose daily output is still measured in the same small vessels that first revealed the molecule. Which current high-value fermentation or cell culture product still carries an idiot index set by surface area instead of by the physics of gas transfer? That's First Principles Daily for today. If this changed how you see what things cost, share it with someone who'd appreciate it, and subscribe wherever you listen. I'm Patrick in Vancouver. One example or one opportunity every day. See you tomorrow. And if you'd rather watch than listen, find us on YouTube at NEH-RA Network. Links in the show notes. This episode used AI voice synthesis of my voice. Editorial selection and analysis are my own.